Imagine, if you will, a world where your natural instincts, your boundless energy, your innate drive to compete, to build, and to protect are treated not as assets.
But as clinical disorders.
Exactly. Imagine waking up every day and stepping into an environment that is meticulously designed to pathologize your very existence.
Where the simple act of being a boy is viewed as a condition that needs to be medicated, managed, and eventually, well, eradicated.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Before we jump into the deep end today, please remember to like and subscribe to the Deep Dive to support the show. It really helps us keep bringing you these intense, unfiltered explorations of the texts that are shaping our cultural reality.
It is a profoundly unsettling premise to start on. The proposition that what is biologically natural, what's been hardwired into the human species over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, is now being institutionally condemned as a defect.
That is the exact tension we are unpacking today. We are doing a comprehensive cover-to-cover review of the explosive new 2025 ebook, Pro-Men, Neo-Marxist Capture of Institutions, Demonization of Masculinity, Drugging of Boys, Pathologizing of Men, and Female Supremacist Misandry by Conrad Riker.
And for those of you listening, you can buy this must-read book right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Let me frame this deep dive explicitly for you. If you are a man in the manosphere, a men's rights advocate, or simply someone trying to understand the history of how our institutions were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies long before most of the public even noticed, this book is written specifically for you.
It's an incredibly dense, provocative text. Riker isn't pulling any punches here. He describes what he sees as a systematic, decades-long war on boys.
Particularly within the modern education system.
Right. He meticulously tracks the policy shifts, the funding mechanisms, and the ideological frameworks that have transformed schools from places of learning into what he argues are essentially ideological processing plants.
Now, before we get into the weeds, I want to be clear with you. Because this text contains highly charged political content regarding left-wing and right-wing ideologies, we want to make it absolutely clear that we are not taking sides or endorsing the author's viewpoints.
Our job today is to act as your guides.
Right? Impartially reporting on the ideas and evidence presented in the source material so you can understand the author's exact arguments.
That's the most productive way to approach a text like this. Our mission is synthesis and analysis. We're going to look at the raw data Riker provides, the specific historical anecdotes he highlights, and the philosophical frameworks he uses to diagnose the current state of masculinity.
Tracing the through line of his argument from the classroom to the broader culture.
Exactly.
I want to start with the very foundation of Riker's thesis, the concept he calls the medicalization of masculinity.
It's a massive claim right out of the gate.
It really is. That modern schools are no longer designed for boys in any functional capacity. He refers to them as conditioning centers. How does he justify that terminology? What exactly is the environment demanding of these kids?
The justification really comes down to an analysis of baseline expectations. Riker argues that the modern classroom demands absolute compliance.
Physical stillness.
Yes, and a very specific type of emotional expressiveness. He posits that this environment is fundamentally at odds with male biology.
He leans heavily into evolutionary psychology here.
Heavily. If you look at male biology, it's hardwired for risk assessment, for physical competition, kinesthetic learning, and the physical mastery of an environment.
Which, for the vast majority of human history, were not just normal, they were essential.
Essential traits required for the survival of the tribe.
But Riker is saying those survival traits are now a liability in a third-grade classroom.
Yeah.
When a boy acts like a boy, when he fidgets, when he wants to run, when he naturally challenges authority or tests boundaries, the system doesn't view that as a normal developmental phase.
It doesn't view it as boyhood.
The book argues that this behavior has quite literally been turned into a psychiatric billing code.
That is the core of his evolutionary mismatch theory. Over the last few decades, we've placed boys into institutional environments that are overwhelmingly designed by and calibrated for a female behavioral baseline.
Because of the demographics of the teachers.
Right. Riker points to the demographic reality that over 80% of elementary school teachers are women. His argument is that many of these educators, operating within a system designed for quiet compliance, unconsciously expect boys to behave like quiet, compliant girls.
And when the boys inevitably fail to meet that female-coded behavioral standard,
They aren't viewed as boys being boys. They're viewed as defective girls.
that framing is fascinating, treating them as defective rather than just different.
But you mentioned a psychiatric billing code earlier. I really want to understand the mechanics of this. The financial incentive.
Right, because Riker doesn't just treat this as a cultural accident. He points to a very specific financial mechanism driving this massive spike in ADHD diagnoses. He brings up the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. IDEA.
Yes.
How does federal funding actually incentivize the pathologizing of normal boy behavior?
This is where Riker's analysis moves from sociology into institutional economics. Under the IDEA framework, schools receive specific federal funding allocations for students who are diagnosed with behavioral or learning disorders.
And originally this was for severely disabled children.
Noble intentions, exactly, to ensure they received adequate resources. However, Riker tracks how the definitions began to expand. As district budgets tightened across the country, administrators realized something.
What's that?
Every child diagnosed with a disorder like ADHD brought additional federal dollars into the school's coffers.
So you have a system that financially rewards the labeling of children.
Precisely.
The more boys you can classify as having a psychiatric disorder, the more money the district receives. That is a perverse incentive structure.
It creates a feedback loop. The teacher is frustrated by a boy's natural kinetic energy because she has 30 kids in a room and needs silence. The administration needs funding.
And the parents are told their child is disruptive and falling behind.
And waiting in the wings with the solution is the pharmaceutical industry.
Oh man, and Riker explicitly follows the money there too. He calls out big pharma lobbying with some staggering numbers.
$2.8 billion.
Between 1998 and 2023, spent lobbying U.S. lawmakers. He argues they market ADHD as an epidemic because from a business perspective, every new diagnosis of a 7-year-old boy is a lifelong customer.
The alignment between overwhelmed schools, federal funding policies, and pharmaceutical profit models, that's what Riker calls the medicalization industrial complex.
And he provides some truly chilling examples of how this bureaucratic alignment plays out on the ground in the lives of individual families. I want to dig into those anecdotes.
The human cost is brutal.
It is. He tells the story of a 7-year-old boy in Kentucky, 7 years old. And he was prescribed Adderall, a highly addictive amphetamine. For what exact reason?
According to the case Riker cites, the boy's teacher complained that he jumped too much during circle time.
Jumped to it.
That was the primary behavioral complaint. A 7-year-old boy had too much energy while sitting in a circle on a rug.
It's insanity.
The school pressured the parents to seek a medical evaluation, strongly suggesting that the boy could not return to a normal classroom setting unless he was medicated to control his impulses.
The book mentions that his father, who was a firefighter, absolutely refused and ended up suing the school district for medical coercion.
And he won.
He won the right to keep his kid off the drugs. But Riker uses this to ask a terrifying question. What about the millions of dads who don't have the resources or the stubbornness to fight a protracted legal battle against a school district?
How many parents simply bow to the pressure from the quote-unquote expert?
And hand over the pillbox every morning just so their kid isn't ostracized.
That pressure is systemic. And Riker provides another data point to show just how deeply ingrained it is. He cites a 2022 case in a Texas school district where administrators were actually caught using ADHD diagnoses as a key performance indicator.
Wait, pause on that. A KPI. Like a corporate sales target.
Precisely. Staff members were receiving financial bonuses for identifying more cases of behavioral disorders.
They had quotas.
They had quotas to meet. Riker argues that when you reach the point where school counselors are getting a Christmas bonus based on how many boys they can push toward a psychiatric evaluation, you're no longer operating a healthcare system.
Or an education system. You are operating an industrial quota system for medicating children.
Yes.
And the most maddening part of Riker's analysis is his breakdown of what these drugs are actually doing to the kids. You'd think if we're going to pump millions of developing male brains full of amphetamines, the long-term results must be spectacular there.
You would hope.
But he points to a 2020 meta-analysis published in The Lancet. What did that study actually find?
The Lancet meta-analysis is a crucial piece of evidence in his argument. It analyzed the outcomes of children prescribed ADHD medication over an extended period.
And the findings.
The findings showed that while the medication does improve short-term focus, meaning it successfully suppresses the child's kinetic energy and makes him sit still in the chair to complete a worksheet, it does absolutely nothing to improve long-term academic outcomes.
Nothing.
It doesn't improve high school graduation rates, it doesn't improve long-term standardized test scores, and it doesn't improve social functioning or career success later in life.
So zero long-term benefit. It is purely a chemical restraint to make the school day easier for the administration. Riker asserts that we are essentially running a blind, unmonitored experiment on millions of developing male brains.
And he is incredibly bleak about the extrapolation of this trend.
What is his speculation on the long-term societal fallout?
By systematically suppressing the natural drives of millions of boys with stimulants and sedatives, he argues we are raising an entire generation of men who are compliant, numb, and chemically subdued.
A compliant generation.
Riker posits that a society cannot survive if it chemically castrates the kinetic energy of its youth. You cannot build a civilization, defend a nation, or drive technological innovation with a population of men who have been chemically trained since kindergarten to be passive.
He warns we're eradicating the bold leaders, the protectors, and the risk takers that a functioning society absolutely relies upon.
Yes.
So if you are chemically subduing a boy just to keep him in a chair, it begs the question, what happened to the physical spaces where that energy used to go?
The playground.
Right, because 20, 30 years ago, that kid who couldn't sit still didn't need a pill. He just needed 20 minutes on the playground to sprint it out. How does Riker address the physical environment of the schools themselves?
This is a major pillar of his analysis. He argues that the medicalization of boys is happening concurrently with the eradication of their physical outlets. Riker details the systematic elimination of recess and physical education across the country.
Under the pressure of standardized testing.
And academic quotas, yes. Schools have stripped away the unstructured physical play that boys biologically require.
And he notes what they are replacing it with, which is almost comical if it weren't so damaging. The book talks about schools substituting physical recess with things like mindfulness coloring.
Or having the kids sit in a circle for emotional check-ins.
You cannot domesticate masculine energy with a coloring book.
You really can't. Riker highlights the physiological reality that boys, on average, require significantly more gross motor activity than girls to regulate their nervous systems.
But schools are responding to this biological need, not with accommodation,
but with suppression. He brings up a case study of a school district in Georgia that decided to remove recess completely in 2017.
Entirely removed it.
The administration's stated goal was to reclaim that time for instructional minutes to boost their state test scores.
And the result of trapping those boys indoors all day, the book notes a 42% spike in male behavior reports in a single academic year.
42%.
It's an entirely manufactured crisis. They take away the playground, the boys naturally get restless and act out, and then the school points to that restlessness as proof that the boys have a behavioral disorder that requires medication.
Exactly the cycle Riker describes. But he goes further than just the loss of recess. He examines how the system treats the boys when they do attempt to engage in natural play.
The criminalization of play.
He heavily critiques the implementation of zero-tolerance policies and frameworks like the Safe Schools Improvement Act. Riker argues that these policies, often drafted under the guise of preventing severe violence, are applied so broadly that they treat average boys not as students, but as potential predators or latent criminals.
The examples he gives of this criminalization are mind-blowing. We aren't talking about kids bringing actual weapons to school. We are talking about the criminalization of boys' imagination.
Yes.
Take the story of the 6-year-old black boy in Florida. Can you walk through the absurdity of how the administration handled that?
It's a profound example of administrative hysteria. Picture a 6-year-old boy sitting in his elementary school cafeteria. He's eating a strawberry Pop-Tart. He bites the corners off the pastry, looks at it, and because he's a little boy with a natural, healthy imagination,
He thinks it looks like a gun.
he thinks the shape resembles a gun. He points the pastry at the ceiling and says, "Bang."
And in a sane world, a teacher might tell him to stop playing with his food.
But under these zero-tolerance frameworks, the school administration treated this 6-year-old child as an active security threat.
They literally called the school resource officer over a pastry.
They brought in law enforcement, and the 6-year-old boy was placed in handcuffs.
Handcuffs.
The psychological trauma inflicted on a child by arresting him for an imaginary game is staggering. Riker uses this to illustrate that the system is completely divorced from the reality of child development.
The innate male instinct for rough and tumble play, for imaginary conflict, and for playing the hero or the soldier is being treated as a criminal offense.
He brings up another case. A 10-year-old in Ohio who was expelled.
And not suspended, expelled.
Expelled. His crime. Having a tiny Lego gun, a toy piece about the size of a quarter, and a brightly colored plastic Nerf gun in his backpack.
It was a toy his parents had just bought him for his birthday. The school didn't care about context. They treated a piece of plastic like a weapon violation, under their zero-tolerance rules. It's as if boyhood itself is considered contraband.
Riker contrasts this madness with environments that actually respect and utilize male biology. He highlights a program in Naperville, Illinois, which implemented something they called Learning Readiness PE.
I found this part fascinating because it proves the exact opposite of the current mainstream methodology. What did Naperville actually do?
Instead of forcing the students to sit still and do mindfulness exercises, Naperville instituted intense, heart-pumping aerobic activity right in the morning.
Before the first academic period even began.
Yes, they had the kids running, getting their heart rates up to a specific target zone. The biological theory is that intense physical exertion floods the brain with dopamine and norepinephrine.
Which naturally regulates attention and impulse control, which is exactly what ADHD medication attempts to do synthetically. So what were the results of simply letting the kids run?
The results were phenomenal. Discipline issues practically vanish across the board. Furthermore, their academic performance, specifically their math and science scores, went through the roof.
Elevating the district to some of the highest testing percentiles in the world.
Yes.
It's an incredible juxtaposition. Naperville leans into male biology, embraces the need for physical exertion, and sees massive success. But the mainstream system suppresses it, pathologizes it, and ends up handcuffing 6-year-olds.
And Riker asks a really profound question here about the broader societal conditioning taking place.
We have a society that runs active shooter drills in kindergartens, right? These drills teach children absolute passive obedience.
Hiding in closets.
Turning off the lights, submitting in silence, and hoping the threat goes away.
Riker points out the deep psychological contradiction here. The schools are enforcing this passive obedience while simultaneously punishing the innate male instinct to protect, to confront, and to fight back against a threat.
If a boy shows any inclination toward protective aggression or physical confrontation, even in play, he is suspended or medicated.
Riker argues that we are systematically training the protector out of the boy, leaving society vulnerable because we've conditioned our men to hide in the dark rather than confront danger.
This leads us directly into the psychological warfare aspect of the book. If boys are being punished for their physical energy and their protective instincts are labeled as dangerous, how are their internal psychological traits being managed?
That's where he introduces the misandrous double bind.
And his breakdown of the toxic masculinity myth is incredibly sharp. How does he define this double bind?
The misandrous double bind is perhaps Riker's most potent observation regarding the psychological trap that modern men and boys find themselves in. He defines it as a societal framework where men are relentlessly shamed for displaying traditional masculinity.
Traits like stoicism, physical dominance, emotional reserve, or intense competitiveness.
They are lectured constantly that these traits are toxic and that they need to open up, be vulnerable, and cry.
But it's a trap.
Exactly. The double bind is that when men actually follow this advice, when they show vulnerability, when they express weakness, fear, or insecurity, they are immediately punished.
Rejected or openly mocked by the very same institutions and individuals who demanded they open up.
They are viewed as pathetic or unmanly, so they are damned if they are stoic and they are damned if they are vulnerable.
He traces this institutionalization of this double bind right up to the highest levels of psychology. He points to the American Psychological Association, the APA. In 2018, they released new guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men.
And Riker absolutely tears into this document.
What did the APA actually declare?
The APA guidelines explicitly stated that traditional masculinity, which they defined as including traits like anti-femininity, achievement, eschewal of the appearance of weakness, and adventure, risk, and violence, is psychologically harmful.
They essentially categorized the foundational traits of masculinity as a pathology that restricts men's psychological development.
Riker argues this pseudoscience has been thoroughly weaponized in teacher training programs. Educators are taught to view a boy's desire to compete and win, or his refusal to cry when he skins his knee, as signs of toxic socialization that need to be deconstructed.
Furthermore, Riker highlights a glaring systemic hypocrisy in how aggression is handled. He points out that female aggression,
which typically manifests as relational sabotage, spreading rumors, social isolation,
reputational destruction,
that is largely ignored by the school system. It's often treated as complex social development or just girls being girls.
Think of the classic Mean Girls dynamic. The psychological damage that causes is immense, but the school rarely intervenes.
Exactly. But if a boy exhibits basic male fitness, assertiveness, or engages in rough physical play, it is immediately flagged as a precursor to violence, and labeled a threat to the safety of the school.
The system criminalizes male aggression while giving a free pass to female aggression.
The book provides some chilling, real-world examples of how far this ideological policing has gone. Look at the case he cites from Canada.
A 12-year-old boy was reported for a hate crime under the Canadian Human Rights Act. What was the horrific slur this child used?
He said the phrase, "boys will be boys."
A 12-year-old kid repeating a centuries-old idiom about male behavior was dragged into a human rights tribunal framework.
Or the case of the 14-year-old in Oregon. This kid was literally suspended from school for doing push-ups at the lunch table.
Suspended for push-ups. Why?
Because a school counselor decided that his display of physical effort was intimidating to the other students.
Riker uses these examples to show that the policing of masculinity isn't just about preventing harm, it's about suppressing male excellence and physical vitality.
And he extends this analysis beyond the schoolyard into adult relationships to illustrate how pervasive this double bind truly is.
The anecdote about the bodybuilder perfectly encapsulates this. Walk us through that story, because it highlights the romantic and social consequences of the double bind.
Riker shares the story of a young man who began bodybuilding. For 2 years, he dedicated himself to the gym, built massive amounts of muscle, and increased his testosterone and physical dominance.
And his girlfriend.
Throughout this process, his girlfriend enthusiastically encouraged him. She celebrated his progress, called him her king, and praised his dedication.
But the moment he actually won his first major competition,
The moment he achieved peak physical dominance and true male assertiveness, her attitude flipped. She dumped him almost immediately, claiming that he was now too aggressive and that his physical presence was intimidating.
she wanted the aesthetics of a dominant man, but she couldn't handle the actual reality of male assertiveness. It's a cognitive dissonance machine.
Riker explores the severe psychological toll this takes on young men.
Imagine growing up in a system where your core identity, your natural physical state, and your baseline psychology are framed as a public nuisance. What is his speculation on where this drives these boys?
Riker argues that this ideological cage is precisely what drives millions of young men toward figures like Andrew Tate, into the deep escapism of online gaming, or straight into pure destructive nihilism.
Because reality has become a cage.
When the mainstream reality of school and society tells a boy that he is fundamentally wrong for existing, that his ambition is toxic, and that his physical energy is a disease, he will inevitably seek out alternative realities.
You will find echo chambers on the internet that not only validate his masculinity, but often weaponize his resentment against the society that rejected him.
Which brings us to a critical pivot in the book.
Yes, if the behavioral policies and the physical environments have been completely overhauled to suppress boys, how does that manifest in the actual academic material? What are they forcing these boys to learn while they sit quietly in their chairs?
Riker's chapter on the neo-Marxist capture and the feminist curriculum is arguably the most enraging part of the text. He asserts that the ideological shift in what is taught is not an accident. It is deliberate and systemic.
Riker outlines a massive ideological purge of the curriculum. He argues that classical Western literature, the epic narratives of the hero's journey, tales of conquest, bravery, self-sacrifice,
With exploring of the unknown.
the very stories that have inspired boys for generations have been intentionally replaced. Replaced by what? What is the new baseline for literature and history?
He categorizes the new curriculum as being dominated by trauma-based, feminist, and neo-Marxist texts. His argument is that the shift purposefully alienates boys from the process of reading and learning.
Because it doesn't speak to them.
Instead of narratives of male triumph, agency, and overcoming insurmountable odds, the curriculum now centers on narratives of victimhood, systemic oppression, and historical grievance.
Boys are no longer taught to identify with the hero. They are taught to identify themselves as the inheritors of the oppressor class.
He introduces the concept of equity education.
Which sounds great on a brochure.
But the mechanics of it, as Riker describes them, are terrifying. According to the sources he cites, fundamental concepts like merit, logic, and competition are now literally being framed by educators as tools of white supremacy and patriarchy.
That is the core of the neo-Marxist critique of education. The framework assumes that any system that produces unequal outcomes must be inherently corrupt.
Therefore, traditional markers of success like getting the correct answer on a math test, speaking with clear rhetoric, or outperforming peers are viewed not as achievements, but as evidence of systemic privilege.
Riker argues that under this equity model, high-achieving boys aren't celebrated. They are penalized, held back, or shamed in order to artificially close outcome gaps.
The illustrative content he provides here is just staggering. He mentions a teacher in North Carolina who faced disciplinary action from their administration for assigning J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings.
What was the administration's rationale for banning one of the greatest works of fantasy literature ever written?
The stated rationale was that the book promotes male-dominated military structures.
Are you kidding me?
And that it centers on a patriarchal, Eurocentric worldview of good versus evil. The administration felt it was inappropriate for a modern, inclusive classroom.
Banning Tolkien because Aragorn is too masculine. And it doesn't stop there. The book details how classic literature that remains in the curriculum is completely subverted. He talks about Herman Melville's Moby Dick.
Being taught not as an epic exploration of obsession, madness, and the terrifying power of the sea,
but as a metaphor for ecofeminist shame and the harmful patriarchal need to control and dominate nature.
it is the complete deconstruction of the original text to serve a modern ideological agenda.
But Riker argues the capture goes far beyond literature. It has infected the hard sciences and mathematics. He cites a highly controversial math curriculum implemented in Oakland, California.
This was the one that made national headlines.
What were they teaching fifth graders in math class?
The curriculum guidelines explicitly encourage teachers to instruct fifth graders that capitalism is a form of violence.
In math class.
Furthermore, the framework suggested that requiring students to show their work to arrive at a single objective correct answer in mathematics is a white supremacist practice.
Rooted in a patriarchal need for control and perfectionism. They are teaching kids that objective reality and basic arithmetic are racist and sexist. How is a boy supposed to learn engineering or physics if he is taught that getting the right answer is a form of oppression?
And this isn't just happening in fringe districts. Riker points to the College Board, the organization that controls AP testing for the entire country.
Yes, he cites leaked internal memos and scoring rubrics from the AP literature exams. These documents show that scorers are being trained to reward students not for their objective ability to analyze prose or structure,
But for their ability to interrogate hegemonic narratives of male dominance.
meaning a student's actual literary comprehension is secondary to their ability to perform feminist orthodoxy on the test. If they don't parrot the neo-Marxist talking points, they don't get the college credit.
Let's pause and look at the macro implications of this. What happens to the economic and cultural future of a nation where 80% of high school seniors reportedly graduate believing that capitalism is fundamentally exploitative?
Riker's speculation on this is grim. He envisions a society facing catastrophic innovation stagnation. If you raise a generation of boys who are taught to apologize for historical achievements, who are taught that men like George Washington, Winston Churchill, or the pioneers of the Industrial Revolution were merely evil oppressors rather than flawed but brilliant leaders to learn from, you destroy the ambition of your future workforce.
You cannot maintain a first world economy, let alone compete globally with nations like China, if your young men believe that ambition and wealth creation are morally evil.
If the curriculum has been so thoroughly captured and weaponized against boys, we have to ask, who is delivering this curriculum? This leads directly into Riker's analysis of the demographic cliff in education. He details the systematic erasure of men from educational spaces.
Categorizing male teachers and fathers as living in institutional exile.
The demographic statistics Riker provides are stark. He notes that the educational workforce in the United States is now somewhere between 76% and 85% female, depending on the grade level.
In early childhood and elementary education, it's almost entirely female. But Riker's argument is that this is not merely a natural demographic shift or a matter of career preference. He asserts it is the result of an ideological purge.
He points specifically to the weaponization of Title IX and the Me Too movement. How have these frameworks been used to push male educators and fathers out of the schools?
He describes the creation of an environment defined by default suspicion. In modern educational spaces, the mere presence of an adult male is frequently treated as an inherent liability, a potential threat to the safety of the children.
Male teachers are forced to operate under a different set of unwritten rules than their female counterparts.
Policies, both official and unofficial, demand that male teachers keep their classroom doors wide open at all times. They are advised to avoid any physical contact with students.
Even a high five.
Even a high five, a pat on the back for a job well done, or comforting a crying child is strictly taboo for a male teacher, whereas it's considered nurturing when a female teacher does it.
It's a presumption of guilt just for having a Y chromosome. And the data backs up how dangerous this environment is for a man's career. Riker cites a terrifying statistic from the National Association of Social Workers regarding false accusations.
Yes, the statistic states that approximately 1 in 10 male teachers will face false accusations of misconduct during their careers.
1 in 10. Think about the psychological pressure of going to work every day knowing there is a 10% chance your life could be ruined by a fabricated rumor.
He tells a heartbreaking story of a gym teacher in Michigan to illustrate how easily this happens.
The Michigan case is a perfect example of the fragility of a male educator's career. This was a man who had coached and taught for 17 years with an unblemished record. He was respected by the community.
But he was suspended.
Suspended, investigated, and ultimately blacklisted from the profession because a 13-year-old girl told a school counselor that the teacher looked at her wrong during stretching warm-ups.
Looked at her wrong.
There was no evidence. There were no witnesses corroborating inappropriate behavior. There was no physical contact. Just a vague, subjective allegation of a glance, and 17 years of dedicated service were erased. His career was destroyed.
And Riker emphasizes that this atmosphere of default suspicion extends beyond the staff. It is directed fiercely at fathers as well. He details how fathers are actively marginalized and treated as hostile outsiders by the educational community.
The story of the father in Ontario is a perfect example of this hostility. What happened when he tried to help out at his son's school?
It was a bizarre escalation. A father in Ontario noticed that the swing set on the school's playground, which his son played on daily, had a broken chain. It was a safety hazard.
Right.
Because the school hadn't fixed it for weeks, he brought a wrench and a replacement link during recess to fix it himself. He wasn't aggressive, he was performing a basic act of community maintenance.
But the school administration reacted as if he were an intruder.
They called security, and this father was literally physically tackled to the ground by campus security officers in front of the students simply for trying to fix a piece of playground equipment.
It perfectly encapsulates the system's absolute terror of unchecked male agency. A man fixing a problem with a tool is viewed as a security threat.
And the bureaucratic hurdles fathers face just to participate in their children's lives are insane. Riker mentions schools intentionally replacing Father's Day celebrations with primary caregiver celebrations to erase the specific role of the dad.
The examples of bureaucratic exclusion are intense. He cites one school in Massachusetts that demanded fathers submit written essays proving their emotional safety in the home before they were permitted to attend a school event.
And he brings up a policy in the Los Angeles Unified School District that requires fathers, particularly divorced or separated fathers, to give 72 hours written notice and be accompanied by a female administrative chaperone just to visit their own children on campus during lunch.
You have to be chaperoned to eat a sandwich with your own kid.
Let's examine the fallout of this. Riker forces the reader to consider the massive sociological impact of raising an entire generation of boys who have zero positive male role models in their daily institutional lives.
From the time they are dropped off at kindergarten to the time they graduate high school, they are managed, evaluated, and disciplined almost exclusively by women. What fills the vacuum left by the exile of male teachers and fathers?
Nature abhors a vacuum. Riker argues that the need for male authority, for structure, for initiation, and for a masculine hierarchy doesn't disappear just because the school bans it.
If boys cannot find positive, localized male role models to look up to, coaches, male teachers, involved fathers, they will seek it elsewhere.
He argues this vacuum is directly responsible for the massive surge in extreme internet personalities, radical online communities, and, in inner-city environments, gang culture.
Gangs offer a corrupted version of what boys naturally crave.
Male camaraderie, strict hierarchy, loyalty tests, and a clear path to earning respect through physical courage.
We have spent the bulk of this deep dive unpacking Riker's incredibly bleak diagnosis of the system. But the book doesn't end in despair. It is ultimately a strategic manual.
Let's move into his aggressive call to action and what he outlines as the real-world solutions.
Let's talk about the pushback, the grassroots rebellion, and what he categorizes as the red pill resistance. What is his alternative model?
Riker's proposed solutions are diametrically opposed to every current trend in modern education. He doesn't advocate for reforming the current system.
He advocates for abandoning its core philosophies entirely.
He calls for the immediate restoration of strict, clear hierarchies. He demands the reintroduction of highly competitive, physically demanding play. And most controversially, he argues for a massive pivot towards single-sex education for boys.
He backs this up by contrasting the catastrophic failures of modern, gender-neutral experiments with the overwhelming success of unapologetically male-centric environments. Let's look at the failures first.
He targets Scandinavia, which is often held up as the progressive utopia.
What happened with Sweden's Igalia preschool?
Igalia was an internationally publicized experiment in radical gender-neutral education. The school literally banned the use of the pronouns he and she and forbade the words boy and girl. They removed any toys that encouraged traditional gender roles.
And the outcome?
Riker cites follow-up psychological studies indicating that the boys subjected to this environment did not become more egalitarian. Instead, they became highly anxious, socially withdrawn, and exhibited deep confusion about their identities and boundaries.
And Finland, which used to be the gold standard for global education, implemented similar gender-neutral curriculum changes. Riker notes that following those changes, their global reading and math scores for boys absolutely tanked.
But data proves that when you try to engineer masculinity out of boys, they don't thrive, they collapse.
Against those progressive failures, Riker sets the massive success of highly structured traditional environments. The primary example he uses is the Barack Obama Male Leadership Academy, or BOEM LA, located in Dallas, Texas.
This is a public school, right?
What are they doing differently that is yielding such incredible results?
Yes, it's a public magnet school, but it operates as an all-boys academy. The environment is built entirely around male biology and psychology. They utilize strict discipline, a clear rank and hierarchy system, and uniforms.
Most importantly, they incorporate kinetic learning.
They mandate movement breaks every 20 minutes because they acknowledge that boys need to move to think. The teaching staff is heavily male-centric, providing the constant localized role models that are missing in the mainstream system.
And the results. BOEM LA boasts a 98% graduation rate, with the vast majority of its students going on to four-year colleges. It is absolute proof that boys are not broken. The boys don't need medication, they need an environment that respects how they are built. The system is what's broken.
Riker outlines how fathers across the country are waking up to this reality and launching a grassroots rebellion. He details several underground networks.
Tell me about Father Alert.
Father Alert is a fascinating decentralized network Riker highlights. It's an underground coalition of parents, primarily fathers, who actively track and share information regarding unauthorized medication attempts or ideological overreach by school districts.
If a school attempts to coerce a parent into putting a child on ADHD medication, or attempts to implement a curriculum without parental consent,
this network mobilizes legal resources, shares templates for pushback, and exposes the school's actions.
it's an insurgency against the medicalization industrial complex. And it's not just online, it's physical pushback. He talks about a group in Idaho that formed something called Dad's Watch. This is incredible. What exactly do they do?
Dad's Watch is a group of fathers who decided to stop writing angry emails and start using their physical presence. They organize groups of men to silently attend local school board meetings.
They don't necessarily yell or protest.
They simply stand in the back of the room, arms crossed, recording every vote and every statement made by the administration.
Riker argues that the sheer stoic physical presence of organized, uncompromising men has successfully intimidated several administrations into reversing anti-boy policies.
Yeah.
It is the deployment of traditional masculinity to protect their children from institutional capture.
And for the fathers who realize the public system is beyond saving, Riker details the rise of the ultimate exit strategy: red pill schools and localized microschools.
These are parallel institutions being built from the ground up by disaffected parents.
These microschools are completely rejecting the state curriculum. They are focusing heavily on classical education logic, rhetoric, mathematics, and rigorous physical training. Riker highlights a specific pedagogical tool many of these schools use called Failure Fridays.
I love this concept. Explain what Failure Fridays are and why they are so vital for a boy's development.
In direct contrast to the mainstream culture of participation trophies and protecting children from any negative emotions, Failure Fridays require boys to stand up in front of their peers and present a project, a physical challenge, or a debate argument that they completely failed at during the week.
They have to own the failure.
Analyze why they fell short, and take feedback from the group on how to improve. It teaches absolute accountability, resilience, and the understanding that failure is not a trauma to be avoided, but a necessary step in the pursuit of excellence.
It builds anti-fragility, which brings us to Riker's concluding macroeconomic theory, something he calls educational Darwinism.
He extrapolates that if the public school system continues its current trajectory, if it continues to alienate men, pathologize boys, and teach a curriculum rooted in ideological grievance, fathers will simply continue to exit the system.
They will take their tax dollars, their resources, and their children, and they will build these parallel, hyper-competent private institutions.
And that raises an existential question for the public education system. Riker posits that you cannot sustain a public institution if it actively goes to war with half of its constituency.
If the most involved, resourced, and dedicated families abandon the public schools to build microschools, the public system will face a catastrophic loss of funding, legitimacy, and ultimately survival.
It is a massive societal realignment happening right under our noses.
Which brings us to a final lingering question for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. A thought experiment inspired by the text, but looking beyond the immediate horizon. If the current mainstream education system was successfully redesigned over the last 50 years to prioritize absolute compliance and suppress masculine energy,
What will society look like 50 years from now?
think about the boys currently being raised in these red pill microschools, homeschool co-ops, and academies like Bomai. They are being forged in hierarchy, competition, physical resilience, and classical logic.
What happens when those boys come of age and enter the real-world marketplace to compete against the products of the mainstream, chemically subdued participation trophy system?
It is a profound societal divergence that Riker is predicting. We are looking at the creation of a massive competence gap. Two entirely different models of human development, operating on fundamentally opposing philosophies, clashing in the future marketplace of ideas, economics, and leadership.
The outcome of that clash will define the next century.
Listen, to keep getting the raw data, to learn the strategies for pushback, and to join the community of men who are refusing to surrender their sons to this system, you need to follow the author directly. You can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack. That's conradriker.substack.com.
And a final reminder that we have only scratched the surface of the data provided in this text. To grasp the full arsenal of facts, the deep historical context of the institutional capture, and the detailed policy analysis Riker provides, reading the source material in its entirety is absolutely essential.
Absolutely. Go search for the ebook Pro-Men Neo-Marxist Capture of Institutions, Demonization of Masculinity, Drugging of Boys, Pathologizing of Men, and Female Supremacist Misandry on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now. Arm yourself with the knowledge. One last time, please remember to like and subscribe to the Deep Dive to support the show. Thank you for joining us on this intense, unflinching exploration of the source material. We will see you next time.